Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Remember archaeology? Well, I do, and I miss it. In this video, we're going to briefly go over its history, its removal, and discuss why it should be brought back. So if this was before anyone's time, archaeology was the fourth secondary profession added to WoW during the Cataclysm expansion, supplementing the existing cooking, fishing, and first aid professions. The basic gist of it is that you would travel to dig sites out in the open world and use your survey ability within these dig sites. This would spawn a little telescope that would point in the general direction of the artifact fragment you were digging up, as well as a radar light that would shine green, yellow, or red based on how far away you were from the artifact. You would keep doing this, usually 6 or 9 times per dig site depending on the expansion, and then that dig site would disappear, being replaced by another one on the same continent. And there would always be several up, so you had some leeway on where you decided to go. Although a dig site would always remain until you cleared it out, so you would want to do it eventually. The artifacts were also divided into different races depending on where you were digging, and it was usually pretty intuitive. If you're digging around a bunch of Night Elf ruins, you're going to be finding Night Elf artifact fragments. In vanilla zones, you could find Dwarf, Fossil, Night Elf, and Troll fragments. Outland had Orc and Draenei fragments. Northrend had Nerubian and Vrykul. Cataclysm zones used the same races as the vanilla ones, but added Tol'vir to the mix. Pandaria added Mantid, Mogu, and Pandaren. Draenor had the Arakoa, Orc clans, and Ogres. The Broken Isles had Demon, Highborn, and High Mountain Tauren. And Zandalar and Kultiris respectively had the Zandalari and Drust. Anyway, once you had enough fragments of any given race, you could solve it. This usually resulted in a useless item that you could just sell, but which also had some flavor text to it, which gave some insight into the history of the world. But occasionally, you would be treated with a rare solve, which would grant you a pet, a toy, a mount, or a transmog item. And these rare solves were usually the end goal for any player engaging in archaeology, where once you had completed all of the rare solves, or at least all of the ones you cared about, you had little incentive to continue thereafter. That's the long and short of it, but over the years there were some minor variations in how it worked, such as the pristine solves, which basically had you continue doing those otherwise useless solves until you got a pristine version, and then you could use that to spruce up your garrison, for example. It was a very minor incentive. And in Legion, all of the good items came from, I believe, bi-weekly quests, of which there were 13 in total, so it would take half a year to rotate through all of them. And of course, over the expansions and over the years, Blizzard would continue to iterate upon professions. For example, with Battle for Azeroth, Blizzard made the determination that first aid was no longer really essential for every player to have. Bandages had just become too niche of an item for people to really care about them, and at that point it just made more sense to fold it into tailoring than to clutter up everybody's UI. And it wouldn't take long at all for archaeology to fall victim to a similar fate. Battle for Azeroth was in fact the last time that archaeology was updated, with absolutely nothing added to it in Shadowlands, Dragonflight, or The War Within. Now, due to how archaeology works, it was impossible to just have it absorbed by another profession. And it still offered stuff that players cared about, so they left it in. It just quite fittingly became a relic of the past. And I don't really understand why. Of course, the easy answer is that it was eating up dev time that could be devoted elsewhere, but I have extreme difficulty believing it was a lot of dev time, especially compared to other features of the game. Like, just think about it for a moment. You essentially just need to add 2 or 3 new races per expansion, create a list of items with some lore flavor text attached to them, and map out the dig sites. Perhaps I'm being naive here, but I can imagine one dev knocking it out in a few days. The groundwork is all there, so why did they just randomly decide to forsake the profession? I have absolutely no evidence for this, but it just feels to me like some dev decided that it was boring and pushed that agenda on the rest of the team. And part of the reason I got that vibe was because of patch 10.2.7, when they added the Azerothian Archives faction to the Dragon Isles. This had a friendship-style reputation tied to it, and was essentially divided into 2 things. On the one hand, there was the Big Dig Trader's Rest, which was a community feast-style public event located in the Azure Span. This was headed up by Edweird Dalengrieg, who was uncovering the truth of some of Neltharion's past machinations and Syndragosa's efforts to thwart them. And on the other hand, we had world quests where you do one of 3 new tasks. You could be asked to run around absorbing arcane familiars for Narobin, the agoraphobic Drakthir. You could do this weird little task where you had to click a totem to manage a bar for Roksha, the orc shaman, who for some reason was using fire and earthquakes to excavate the artifacts, which just feels intentionally absurd. Or you could be asked to scry out the location of the artifacts for Zenata, using a bar that filled up as you approach them, essentially using a warmer-colder system. The archives as a whole were touted as an experimental alternative to the boring triangulation system that Archaeology had used in the past. But based on my own experience and what I heard from other players at the time, they missed the mark here. I think the Big Dig was fine enough for what it was, but it's kind of irrelevant to the statement they made. Of the 3 world quest activities they offered up, the totem stuff was just downright annoying. The arcane familiar stuff was okay, I guess, with only the scrying quests actually feeling good. So if they ever did decide to revive Archaeology, I'd prefer for them to just stick with the boring triangulation system that it always had. But if they did want to update it in some fashion, I believe the scrying mechanic is probably the best way to go. It's the most spiritually similar to the triangulation system, but it has immediate feedback for you. That way you're not constantly stopping to do another survey to pinpoint where the artifact is. And I think it would solve one of Archaeology's older problems of being quicker to complete by constantly mounting up and zooming over to the other side of the dig site until you were relatively close. A gameplay loop which I believe would have been exacerbated by the introduction of skywriting, as that already involves lots of short bursts of flight. So if you combine that with Archaeology, it would just be parabolas all day long. But clearly that's not why Archaeology was abandoned in the first place. Skywriting wouldn't even be added for another expansion later. And as we move to the War Within, I feel that Delves are serving as the spiritual successor to Archaeology. This is obviously due to Bran Bronzebeard being our Delve companion, and the rest of the League of Explorers, specifically Reno, Elise, and Finley, being his support team back in Dornegal, and at least one of the 11.1 Delves feeling very archaeological in design. Now, personally, I'm not too big on Delves. I think they're fine, but maxing out Bran's reputation bar was way too slow and repetitive in my opinion. But how I feel about them is kind of irrelevant anyways, because they just don't serve the same function that Archaeology does. I mean, yes, they're both fairly easy activities, but one is clearly meant to be more chill than the other. Which sort of brings me to, what was the point of Archaeology in the first place, and why do I think it should come back? Well, I believe that the profession was enjoyable in a similar way to fishing. A relaxed, fun, and minor thing to do to make progress on at your own pace and leisure, and which importantly can be done out in the open world. It was just a nice extra thing to work on when you had some spare time, when you want to be playing WoW but don't have the availability or the drive to be doing actual endgame content. And I really hope they do revive it at some point, perhaps even adding digs to the expansions that they skipped. And it honestly just feels really weird for it to be sitting there unsupported, especially after Dragonflight did so much to revitalize every other profession, particularly the primary ones. And especially now that we're in an expansion where the focus is being deep in the earth, where, you know, artifacts can be dug up. Although, funnily enough, Archaeology has become relevant again in this expansion, because to complete a Farewell to Arms, the Battle for Azeroth meta achievement, you had to wait for a specific world quest in Vol'dun to pop up, talk to Nisha to get a Volpera costume, and then complete a singular dig site in Vol'dun while dressed in that costume. So on January 8th, 2025, scores of North American players completed the first dig site that they had done in 5 years. And sadly, perhaps the last dig site they'll do for another 5. But you can change that, Blizzard, and I hope you do. Because yeah, Archaeology might not be anybody's favorite thing about WoW, but it does not belong in a museum. For this week's drawing, my obvious character of choice was Bran Bronzebeard, easily the most famous archaeologist in Warcraft. And outside of his own crew, really only Harrison Jones can even kind of compete, but that guy has really fallen off the radar. I like Bran well enough. I like him less after having to grind him out to level 60, but I'll get over that. He's a character whose role has kept him at least mildly relevant for much of WoW's history. Pretty much anytime we're exploring some ruins or ancient Titan location, you can throw Bran in there and he'll fit, which has in fact allowed him to easily eclipse his brother Muradin in screen time. Sure, Muradin has served as the Bronzebeard representative on the Council of Three Hammers since Cataclysm, but he really hasn't done, like, anything. anything at all. Anywho's it, I decided to put Bran in the Halls of Stone, although you could probably say this is basically anywhere in the Ulduar complex. But for Horde players, the Tribunal of Ages encounter in Halls of Stone was pretty much our first interaction with the guy. And I gotta say, pretty much AFKing for 5 minutes while he figures the device out, not a great start. It kind of ruined the dungeon for everybody. That being said, I like the rest of the dungeon fine enough, and I'd be happy to see it updated for Mythic Plus. They just need to change how that encounter works. But I think that's about everything for this episode. I also just wanted to quickly thank everyone for the reception to my Death of the Horde video, which is currently sitting at over triple my second highest vendor trash video, which I think goes to show that there are just a lot of players who are feeling the same frustration I am with the Horde. But I will leave that there. This is the Archaeology video. And now it is done. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye!